So we'll start with the session for today. Good morning, everyone. I'm Atya Memon, Social Media and PR Head at the Political Science Association of Wilson College, Bombay. It brings me great joy to welcome you to today's session. I, on behalf of the entire PSA and its participants, deeply express my gratitude to today's resource person, Nidhi Dugar Kundalia. Nidhi Dugar Kundalia is a young journalist, a graduate of School of Arts, City University, London, whose work has featured in various national newspapers and magazines. She has written on socio-cultural issues, documenting human lives and their journeys through urban and rural settings, and over the years created a small body of work on the outcast and the disregarded, living on the fringes of society. Her consistent attempt to not bring the margin to the center, but to make it a place of reality. Today's session is based on the two books that she has written and published. Her first book, The Lost Generation, published by Penguin Random House, was a chronicle of 11 dying professions, remnants of India that still exist in its old streets and neighborhoods, an unshakable sense of belonging to a time that was the everyday life of our ancestors. The book was released in 2016 to a warm reception. Nidhi's second book, White as Milk and Rice, was released days before the lockdown in March 2020. It weaves together prose, oral narratives, and Adivasi history to tell the stories of 6 remarkable tribals of India, reckoning with radical changes over the last century as they were thrown together and then apart in ways none of them fathomed. Thank you, ma'am. We welcome you again.
Hi everyone, this is Nidhi Dugar Kundalia, like Atya had mentioned, and thank you for having me over for the session today. Let's begin. So what I'm going to do is probably, I'm going to divide the session into my 2 books. Let's talk about my first book first, and then we move on to the next book, and then and then I'm going to give a few more details about my general work and my body of work, and then probably we can have an interaction around, and we can keep it quite long so that we cover more there. And let me just introduce the books to you. So my first book was The Lost Generation, and this was published in I think 2016, and what had happened was that I had spent a lot of time growing up with my grandparents, and I had heard a lot of stories about these dying professions that exist. My grandmom had this huge Godrej Almira in her ancestral home. Every time she opened it, all these treasures would just spill out. There would be these zari borders, there would be, funky little objects, there would be like an ivory tusk, and one of them was this little ice cream scooper sort of a thing. And we always wondered what it was, till one time my grandmother mentioned that it was a ear cleaner. And she had bought this from a ear cleaner who used to sit on the streets. And I was fascinated to know about all this. And that sort of sensitized me to these visions on the streets. So every time I traveled around India, I became sensitized to it and started documenting these professions. Especially when I moved to Calcutta. I grew up in Hyderabad. So when I moved to Calcutta, I realized a lot of these professions still exist in the streets of India. And because Calcutta is sort of stuck in time. It's frozen, and a lot of these old visions like the Bishtiwala, the boat maker, the wooden boat makers, and they all still exist. They're very much a part of the fabric of the city. So I started documenting them, and that's how my first book happened. Some of the professions in this book are the Rudalis. I don't know if you've heard of them, but then there was a movie based on them. They were the professional mourners. Now, what we all do not know is, unless you read the book, you do not know, is that Rudalis were of 2 kinds. One was a Rudali who was also a concubine. She basically, so the system, how it worked was that the Rudalis used to hang out with, they were basically concubines to these Thakurs, who were the patriarchs of the society back then, and to a large extent even now. The village that I visited. So, we basically went to this little village in Rajasthan, which had not seen a marriage in the last 10 decades. And the reason was that there were no women in this community. The girls, as soon as they were born, they were killed. So this was a kind of circumstance. This was back in 2012. So as recent as that, female infanticide existed, and it was rampant in villages like these. And this was around Jaisalmer, like somewhere 30 kilometers from Jaisalmer. And the patriarchs, the Thakurs, are still very much a part of the local structure, police, state, government. None of them exist. And these Thakurs, basically, what they do is they hire mistresses. And once children are conceived from these mistresses are put on the edges of the villages so that they act as they come of need when required. Say if a Thakur passes away or the member of a family passes away, these concubines or these Rudalis come to their ceremonies, and since the wife cannot mourn publicly and she has a gungat, the parda, the mistresses mourn, the Rudalis mourn. And that's how the culture started. And soon, these Rudalis became once the Thakur was done with them, she became a part of the village, and she would do odd chores of the villagers, like cleaning or grinding grains from them. And when a person died, acting as a professional mourner, they would be wearing black kurtas, and they would use this liquid called ark, which was so the caste that this profession belonged to was known as the Davras and the Davris. Basically, these the kids who were born to the Rudalis also had to end up becoming mistresses. They went with a if someone was married, one of the Rudali was given to that person as a gift, and this mistress again became a Rudali, and again they became a part of the mourning structure. So this was one of the professions. And then, of course, there were other professions like the street dentists in Baroda who practiced out on the streets on dusty paths, without sanitizing hands, you can't even imagine that sort of a thing in the last 2 years. But then even before that, like without sanitizing their hands, putting their hands down their throats, fixing the stools, making dentures right there on the street, removing teeth without any painkillers or without any anesthesia. So these people still exist because India is, and India is still on the brink of change, and things haven't really happened. Since we have different castes and different classes, and the society is still divided, the lower strata are still not very well taken care of. They resort to these alternate means. Then you have the Godna artists. The Godna artists basically belong to the Godna caste too. And what they used to do was they used to walk around these the edges of these villages, and because they were untouchables, they weren't allowed to enter the villages unless and until there was a Godna or a tattoo to be done. Now, a tattoo was done only to young girls who had not achieved their adolescence yet, and this was done so that a woman, when she died, like a man can be, according to them, a man can be identified in the heaven because, well, he has a certain he belongs to a certain lineage, he belongs to the family, he belongs to a certain patriarchal structure. But a woman may or may not be identified, and that's why she needs a godna. And that's when this untouchable man is brought in from the village. He's not allowed to touch the well. He's not allowed to wear footwear. He has to carry his footwear in the hand. And once in a while, and what he gets in return is probably a little food, some milk or whatever, tea or whatever extras they have available in the house. That's the payment that they make for godna. So that was one of the professions. And then, of course, on one hand, you have these lower caste professions, these professions which are based, according to the kind of strata of society you come from. And then you have someone like the Pandits of Haridwar, the Pandas, who also acted as the genealogists. So, only a Panda's son could become a Panda. This was also a part of the this was sort of like an unsaid rule. And so when he became a Panda, he would he had this little little tail on his head, which very openly said that I am, I am the upper caste man, and he very proudly claimed that he uses an ink to write, to document the families. And the ink is made of almond peels, and it's only used by higher caste hands. Lower caste men weren't allowed to touch the ink. And what they did was basically they would record deaths in the family over the years. So each family had a specific panda which he's supposed to look for once he reaches Haridwar, because there's this whole network of there's a whole network. So you automatically, once you give your name, and if your family has been visiting Haridwar frequently, like I ended up going because my grandfather, when he passed away, his brother told me that I need to go to Haridwar to meet the panda and record his death. And that had always left me curious. So when I went back to Haridwar, I realized that the panda of our family, he had a record of the deaths in my generation up to 8 generations behind me, and essentially there it was like 8 generations of my family. So these also multitasked as the genealogists, we had our own system of genealogy, but unfortunately had they also had to come from a certain section of the society. So, that was one thing. And then, but again, like when you talk to their sons, they no longer want to continue this profession because a lot of these documents are now being digitized by various universities, in spite of all the protests that these pandas have been doing. So the future looks quite bleak for these pandas, because less and less people come and record their deaths, and fewer people are keen on continuing the old traditions. So the future looks bleak, and what the panda really wants is for his son to get educated and probably find work somewhere else in some other field. One of his sons is already in Bangalore in the IT industry. So these were the pandas and the rudalis and the godna artists, and they were the boat makers who were based in Palagar in West Bengal, who used to make wooden boats from hand, who came with their own a set of dreams and ideologies. But of course, like as boats are losing their relevance, wooden boats are losing their relevance, more and more people want boats made of synthetic material because they last longer or they're waterproof, without realizing that they're actually polluting the environment and polluting the whole purpose. Like the fishes are actually reducing in turn. But the problem with and then of course, let me talk about the Burakatha artists, which sort of make this conversation very, very significant. Is the Burakatha artists were basically like these the folklorists. They knew 10s and maybe 20 epics by heart, and they would recite these epics overnight in these sessions in the villages. But of course, like as the TVs came in and the radio came in, fewer people were inclined to sit through these long sessions in the night, which once was such an important part of the village. And now these Burakatha artists are losing relevance. But again, the Burakatha artists who I spoke to, they come from the lower strata of the society, so their payments are of course very, very less. So ultimately, in spite of having such a massive pool of talent, they often have to catch rats to fill their stomachs. So that is the complicated aspect of these old professions in India, because they're so closely related to caste. So if you want to do away with caste, you cannot really keep these really valuable aspects of our society. So some things. By the end of the book, I was questioning myself: is it important to save these professions because they're such an important part of our history? But ultimately, I realized that some things are meant to be relegated to obscurity. Things like cassettes cannot be brought back in times of iPods, can they? So some things are meant to go back. That was the biggest debate that it was that I was having in my head, in spite of being sensitive and in spite of having empathy towards these professionals who practice these professions. So, well, that was my first book, and my second book was The White is Milk and Rice. And this book basically happened while I was, I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago. I was in Bastar, which is a hot belt for Naxalites even today. I was in Bastar, for one of my journalistic assignment, and I met this lady called Birsu. Birsu was one of the sole women protesters amongst a group of villagers protesting against mining operations in that area. And she fascinated me because she was quiet and yet held so much power within her. So I took her name down. The phones don't operate in Bastar because the CRPF does not allow phone networks, since that causes a lot of issues there. So I took down her name and the name of her village. And the next day I decided to visit it to know more about her. But when I ended up at that village, I was so disappointed to know that there was no one by the name of Birsu. I searched almost all day, and finally, when we were about to leave, this was sometime in the afternoon, we saw Birsu just outside that village in the forest collecting firewood, and she was just as surprised to see us. So just when then I started having a conversation. She was surprised to see us because she assumed, just like the other journalists and other politicians, MLAs, collectors that they speak to, they all end up talking to them, but they never really end up coming this far, 5 hours by car and 2 hours on foot to reach their village and to know more about them. But I was there, so she was just as surprised to see me. And she said she gave me the wrong name because she was sure that no one would actually end up coming down to this village. But then we spoke for hours together, and we sieved through a story. And then I went back home and decided to look more about her tribe. So she came from this tribe called Marias. And I was so disappointed to know that all the available information on their tribe was either before the before India's independence, recorded by British anthropologists or German anthropologists, and whatever information that was available after independence, or like years after independence, say the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was either either these exaggerated details about their tribe and the dance, or the dismal condition that they live in. So this was the kind of information that I was getting, and I was acutely aware that I'm not a tribal myself. So is it right that I write about them and write about their stories? But then, like, I spoke to a few writers, and I realized that every story is meant to be told, and I need to add my perspective to, and add to the pool of information that's available. And that's how I decided to write about the tribes of India. And Birsu was essentially, her name was different, but I ended up calling her Birsu in my story. Birsu was Birsu's story is that she grew up in Gotul. Gotuls were basically these adolescents' home where all the young adolescents between 12, 13, 14 years of age would end up at these dormitories and practice sex before marriage. And they weren't allowed to sleep with a partner for more than 3 consecutive days. So they had to change a partner after that. So in spite of growing in such a progressive environment, she still wanted to send her daughter. When Birsu grew up, she wanted to send her daughter to school, because going to school would mean that missing out on the Gotul system. So she, because the schools are in hostels, which are far away from these villages. So when I asked her why, she realized, she told me about this encounter that she'd had with a Naxalite. And she was so surprised that the Naxalites knew more about what they wanted from their life. They had more strength to state what they needed and what they demanded from the society than people of her own village, people who are practicing. It's called the Gotul system, Aniruddha, sorry. People, they would want, so she was keen on sending her daughter to school because of the kind of memory she has from the Gotul, that that was something that was tradition and so valuable to her. But at the same time, there she was around 10, 12 years of age, and and a man was trying to touch her in the way she was extremely uncomfortable about. So, and when we are as a progressive society, modern society, looking at them and looking at their old traditional practices and considering it to be progressive, but in reality, it's a reverse of what they want. So this was one tribe. The other tribe were the Khasis, who were basically a matrilineal society. So what's interesting is that society was matrilineal and not matriarchal. And by that, what we mean is that the society, the wealth of the family is passed on to the youngest daughter of the family. And when they get married to their husbands, the husbands move in with them. It's the women do not go to their father-in-law's or mother-in-law's place. They end up coming, end up coming and living with them. Now you would think that this gives so much power to the women, but in reality, it is just the other way around. Matrilineal system, as like the Khasi women say, is actually a burden to them, because here they are not only holding on to their families, taking care of their families' wealth, but they also have to take care of their children and the the household duties. They have to take care of their uncles, who they are according to tradition, like the mamas, the mothers, brothers, who if they get separated from their wives, end up coming and living with them, since it's a matriarchal system. But when it comes to making political decisions, when it comes to the voting rights in the local governments, the panchayats, when it comes to taking decisions in the family, it is the men who end up taking the decisions. So in reality, it is the women are not only earning the bread for the family, but they're also taking care of the household duties, while men end up taking all the decisions. So it is matrilineal society, but in reality not a matriarchal society, and men are given more power than the women. So that is one aspect that completely took me by surprise. What was it that and when you speak to these women, these women are they complain. The society itself is riddled by drug issues, alcohol issues. The men, since they did not know what their exact role in the society is, they either take to drugs or to alcohol. Most of these villages, most of the markets in these villages, the Khasi villages, you see women selling goods, produces, while men are probably at the bars, at the the local thekas, drinking away their booze. So that is another society which comes with its own unique system. But then when you put it into the modern system, somehow it has left them more confused than ever. And Khasi societies now today have a lot of associations where they want the local tradition of matrilineal to turn into a patrilineal society, and you'll find all these protest groups online. So that's one society. Then there were the Kurumbas of the.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt you, ma'am. Could you just go a little slow, because we're not able to hear the names?
Of course. I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So then there were the Kurumbas of the Nilgiris. Now, with Kurumbas, they were known to be sorcerers. So the sorcerers were the practice was such that every time there was a problem amongst the Kurumba structures, the men weren't allowed to. The Kurumba men weren't allowed to come into the. So the Kurumbas weren't allowed to enter in the villages, because they were known to be the sorcerers. They were known to. This is what the society largely claimed, that they could convert into animals. They knew powers and spells that could finish off villages in the span of minutes. But in reality, Kurumbas actually were the medicine men. So they had control, and they had knowledge of herbs and plants that had power. They were poisonous. They could cure people. And now when the gentleman that I spoke to, Mani, from the Kurumba Society, he's basically now a rebel, and his story goes such that when he tried to join school, as education started coming to the Kurumba Society, as they started emerging from the deep forest, when he started having access to the schooling system, the other communities made fun of him because of his appearances. He had this curly, big bunch of hair like most Kurumbas. He had yellowed eyes. So he was distinct. He was very, very different from what other children in the school were. And ultimately, he was bullied so much that he had to leave school. And again, he did not end up finding jobs and so on and so forth, because of the discrimination that existed towards Kurumbas, because they're still feared as the sorcerers. If Kurumba is moving in through the village, the other villagers just move away because they know that because the superstition is such that he could perhaps perform black magic on them. So Mani ended up becoming a rebel because of the discrimination that was practiced, and now he's protesting for the Kurumba society. He had seen his entire village burn down because they were ostracized and they were bullied at school. So he has seen his entire village burn down. He has seen he has seen his father taking to alcohol because he could not blend in with the modern society. He could not blend in with the other villagers when they were moved out from the forest. So this constant tug and these tribals in India have constantly been facing the issues of getting into the coming. First they were forced out of the forest. This was just I think a few decades after independence. They were forced out of the forest and forced into the mainstream societies. And now because they've been discriminated against, again they're moving back into the forest. So this has left them at loss. They neither have land to their names. They neither have legit ancestral wealth. The forests which were their home, they've been pushed out because they've been declared national reserves and national forests. So this has left them in a vacuum, a space where they do not themselves know what their identity is, and most of them are still not declared scheduled tribes of the according to the constitution. So these were the Kurumbas, and then you had the Halakis, which makes the cover of the book. Halakis were basically Halaki is a tribe, it's a community, a caste based in Uttar Karnataka, North Karnataka, and these women were very, very, very hardworking. In the early morning, they were in the forest collecting firewood. In the afternoon, they were in the fields of other people, since they do not have their own lands. They were in the fields of other higher communities working for their daily wages. In the evenings, they were taking care of their cattle. And then, of course, after that, they went to the markets to sell whatever little goods that they had collected in the forest earlier in the day. And after all this, there were household chores and children. So to kill the mundaneness, to kill the everyday mundaneness of this all, they used to sing. They have a song about everything from marriages to children, to collecting woods, to breaking a branch, to each flower, for each bark, wood, herb. They have a song about everything. And in a way, this has become like an oral history and an oral record of everything that is related to the Halakis. So they have this beautiful tradition. The lady that I met, Sukri, this is not Sukri, but she was more or less dressed like this with beads around her neck and a bare back. So Sukri is a Padma Shri winner, and she's been given the Padma Shri because she's used all these songs now as a part of the protest that have been. She's used these songs to protest against the spurious liquor that is sold in these areas, and because of which all their men have taken to alcohol. Since again, they've been in and out of they recently emerged from the forest, tried to become a part of the mainstream, but again, they're not able to get out from the vicious circle of the poverty. They are exactly where they are. So the men who were once known to be very, very hardworking men, just like their wives, have taken to the alcohol, and the women are working harder than ever. Sukri had lost her. She was married very early to a very old man who was, I think, 30 years older than her. So she lost him. She lost both her children to diseases. She lost the son that she'd adopted to alcohol, to spurious liquor. And now it's just her and her daughter-in-law and her two daughters. So she's fighting for women education. She's fighting for ban on alcohol, forget spurious liquor, because that seems to have wiped out villages after villages in these areas. And then, of course, you have the Kanjars. The next tribe that I record in this book is the Kanjars, who now this essentially was not a caste. This was a community. The Kanjars were actually soldiers who were part of these Rajput armies, and when the Muslim invaders came in around the 13th century, like rulers like Alauddin Khilji came and destroyed villages after villages, lot of these soldiers fled into the forest, and when they could not find any other means of subsistence, they ended up taking to looting and to robbery, and they ended up forming gangs together. Small families who were closely knit and who closely associated each other became a part of the gang. So and that's how the infamous Dakus of Chambal, the dacoits of Chambal, were born. These were the Kanjar. This is the Kanjar tribe. Sometime the gentleman that I had met, he had surrendered in the year 2012, I think, because that's when Vasundhara Raje she came from the areas, the Chambal area. Jhalawar is where she came from, and when she wanted her village to be cleaned of all these practices, and that's when a lot of these men had surrendered. But before that, they were constantly practicing. They were loots, they were dacoits. A lot of these robberies around India could be traced to the Kanjars of Chambal. The women in these gangs also play a very, very important role. Essentially it's a patriarchal society, because these dacoits would beat their women up, and again, but most of the time when these men weren't around, when they were gone looting, they were the ones who maintained the security of their gang. They were the ones who distributed whatever their husbands got. It was a job of a woman to distribute this loot amongst whoever needed, and however the members of the gang, different family sets, how depending upon their need and depending upon their contribution in the robbery. So it was that, and then these women also helped them loot. What they did was something called recce. So they would get out into the villages and they would pretend to sell wares. And while they were selling wares, they very quickly, they would scan the houses. They would look at the women's jewelry and the thickness of the gold that they were wearing. They would make mental notes about the households which were busy with occasions such as weddings and festivals, where they would, there'd be more chances of lacks of security. So so they would go back and then make mental notes about the passages and the places where men could enter from, and they would go back and report all this to their husbands, and then the husbands would come back in the night and finish and wipe the villages off. The women also knew how to kill. They knew how to kill people in one stroke with their poles and their rods and their knives, and with minimal spillage of blood, with minimal noise. They were trained to do everything. But again, it was, but when it came to, but when it came to dire circumstances, when they had little to survive on, they would be the ones, roasting lizards for themselves to eat, while the men were given food so that they could continue with their dacoits and lootery. The women were the first ones. The women had to constantly be in parda and to be in close encounters. And one, of course, one tradition that was practiced among these conjures, which still prevails in amongst most of them today, was when they tested a woman's virginity when she got married. So if the hymen was not, if there was no blood on the sheets after the first night, the women would be beaten up and thrown out. Irrespective of the fact that her hymen could have been broken when she was a younger kid and she was playing. But if there's no spillage of blood on the sheets, then she would be thrown out and she would probably sent back. And in most cases, these women were put to death immediately by their own families, but not by the husband's family, by the maternal family, because she would bring shame to their families. So these are the tribes that I cover in the book, I've picked up about 6 tribes, and a lot of people ask me why I have picked these specific 6 tribes, because it's just that there's so many. There are about like 200 odd tribes in India, and but these 6, I believe, were important because they were on the brinks of change. The shift between old to new is happening just now, and for me it was important to document about all this before it was completely relegated to obscurity. So that's that from me. I would love to open the house to questions and see what comes in. Okay, so Aniruddha wants me to talk about the Konyaks of Nagaland. Of course, the Konyaks were so that's one tribe that I did not talk about. That's the 6th tribe of this book. The Konyaks were the headhunters of Nagaland. Now, the reason they headhunted, the reason they killed other people of other villages was, one, because they were extremely territorial. So back then, the practice stopped sometime in the 1940s, and it was at the peak in 1920s when there were hundreds. The villages were finished, in the middle of these wars between different villages. So the first reason they took heads of other people was because they were territorial. Second, according to Konyaks, these heads, if they were brought back into the village and cleaned and put on their walls, it would bring the men of the family more virility. It would increase the fertility of the family. It would increase the good karma of the family, and it was also, of course, a moment of pride. More the number of heads, more they associated with the strength of the village and the strength of the army that they had created. So these were with the women again. What was the role that they had to play? Essentially, so these women had no voting rights. When the men, every Sunday when they got together, so the Konyaks work in a very interesting system called the village council. So even today, Nagaland is pretty much an autonomous state. It does not come under most parts of the Indian constitution, because they practice more or less, they have their own set of rules, and each region of Nagaland has its own king. And the monarch is, of course, just symbolic. The monarch that I had met of Longwa, he was an opium addict, so he was more or less a symbolic figure. But mostly these villages were governed by something called the village council, where all the men of the heads of the family got together every Sunday and they discussed how would the work be divided through the rest of the week. So irrespective of whose field it was, groups were created, and each group would work in a specific field. So you didn't have to work in your own field. So if you're old, say a group of men will help you do that. A group of men would go hunting and bring back food. A group of men and women would be working in various fields. So while the young mothers and fathers were out in the fields, the grandparents would take care of the children at home. So this is how Nagaland still operates. And although the roles of the men and women are very, very distinct, that women are supposed to do this and men are supposed to do that, But women surprisingly are not looked down upon in spite of having so little to do with warrior practices, etc. Women still more or less have, they are free to do what they want to. Divorces happen very easily in Nagaland, and there is in spite of having distinct roles to play, they have their individuality, and it as in the roles aren't essentially associated with them being looked down upon. It is more of what their physical attributes are, that and they do the work accordingly. Say a woman, one of the women of the village is very strong, then they probably will take her into the warrior community. Although the warrior practices, the headhunting practice is completely over. The last known head that was hunted was in 1992. So although the practices are completely over, they still have, when I spoke to the Konyak men, they were wavering between feelings of pride and guilt. Pride because this is something that they associate with their past and their traditions, and guilt because in the last few decades most of them have converted from animism to Christianity, and the church has induced this guilt in them that this was not right, you had what you practiced was wrong, killing people is wrong, walking around naked is wrong, or eating your meat raw is wrong. So the church has induced this guilt in them. So there's this, but still they cannot, they have nightmares. Even today they have nightmares, and that wakes them up in the night because they're recalling of all these kids and women and men that they've killed. But at the same time, there are these moments of pride, and there's something so feral about them, when they bare their teeth, they're black, so they paint their teeth black as a part of the tradition. The way they talk, when they're talking, they almost growl and not talk. So things have changed a lot for these communities too, but then still they are on that brink of extinction. So well, that's that from me. Let's have some questions from you all, and then we can talk more. Welcome, Anuruddha. So,
Ma'am, go on.
Are there any questions? Do we have any questions? I would like to talk more to the questions that have come in.
Yes, ma'am. So we had 2 questions from the registration forms, and the first one was, why do people think of racial expressions? And then the second one was, is it really racial actions or just supremacist ideology?
Which people are we talking about when we talk about racial expressions?
I think it's referring to the tribes, and I think they meant tribal and casteism, not racism, but it came through the registration form, so I'm just relaying it to you.
Yeah, because more than racism, what existed in these societies was casteism. They the ideas have been so deeply ingrained. They've been so deeply ingrained in their thing, and they're so closely related to what they do in their everyday lives, that there were very distinct roles that these communities had to play. So say the panda was like the supreme, the highest, the purest apparently, and then you had these workers below them who he did not want him to touch his log books, or he did not want him to touch the ink. And he was so proud that out of that little tail on his head, the way he walked and the way he spoke to the people on the streets, very dismissive. But at the same time, when you these vulnerable parts, if you read the book and if you read that specific chapter, there's so many aspects when you're conversing with him, you sense this vulnerability in his tone, because he's realized that what the kind of upbringing that he's had all these years is going away, and what matters is how much money you have, where you stand in a society, what kind of work you do, more than what family you were born into. So that vulnerability was pretty evident. The same thing stood for the Thakur, the Thakur in the village. When I spoke to him, he was massaging his gun, trying to intimidate us while speaking to us. But then at the same time, he was worried. Like, he was worried. He knew like media has a lot of power now. He knew like things can go out of control. If he knew that he should not be attracting the attention of the state at large, the government, the state government at large. So so now that things are changing. Of course, in India, they've always been, changes have always been slowest because of the kind of diversity we work with. But uh, of late, I've seen it change more into a supremacist ideology than casteism, because of course, like this is ingrained in them, and things are changing because now things have become more technical than ever. Like so with the advent of computers and television and radios, that has empowered different kinds of communities. So education is suddenly more accessible, knowledge is more accessible. So it is about who's more empowered than where you're born, in what kind of community you're born in. So I guess that's answering the first question. Can I have the next question?
Yes, ma'am. The next question is from Visha, and she asks, what motivated you to write about these unknown professionals and tribes which are rarely studied?
I think I've answered that in the beginning of my session. That for me it was when I'd heard about these professions. I realized like a lot of people of my generation and probably younger are completely unaware. And when you talk about these professions, you also know about a large part of history and about how social changes happen in our society. So reading and studying about these professions is also essentially studying about social evolution and how that changed, how that came about in our society, how people evolved as individuals. So when you're reading these stories in this book, you're also understanding social evolution at large. So I was very keen on recording this evolution before it was completely relegated to obscurity. Before I wanted to talk to these people and have them in the books. The letter writers of Bombay, who used to sit outside GPU. I wanted to talk to them and have them down there before people who, they're the ones who have written letters for the red light area women. They have written for prostitutes, sex workers. They have written letters for laborers who used to work away from home. They have written letters for people who were cheating on their wives and writing letters to their lovers, or young married couples. All sorts of things, sons sending money back home, women lying to their families about the work that they do in the cities, these sex workers lying about the profession that they practice. So he's seen it all, and it was so important to document that part of history. This is all modern history, so important to document it before it actually becomes history. So that's that, Atya. Can we have the next question?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. The next question comes from Sana. She asks, across tribes, how is the condition of livelihoods now, considering increasing technology and competition?
So again, so a lot of these old traditions and a lot of these old professions that these tribes practice. For example, most of them were into hunting and gathering fruit from the forest, foraging fruit from the forest, and then selling it at the village markets. Things like firewood, berries, fruits, vegetables, wild tomatoes, wild berries, those things. And then so all these old traditions that they practice. Hunting was banned for most of these communities by 60s and 70s at the max. They the slash and burn agriculture that they practice, that was banned even before independence. They're no longer allowed to go into the reserve forest to collect forest food and forage what the local herbs and medicines and firewood. So they have suddenly lost access to all that they very well knew, and all that they that the oral tradition that they had learned from their parents, and so suddenly they've been like pulled out of these forests, and their head has been still spinning and reeling from this big change, because they've been very quickly taken from one place to another, and they're still at the brinks of change. So essentially, most of them, what they're doing now is working for other people, and in a lot of ways being exploited, because they still do not know the ways of the modern society. So they're quite innocent. So they're given very low wages. They are, employed in these mining operations, which is also in turn exploiting their own resources and their homes and pushing them out of their homes. They're looked down upon. They do not have access to good education. So which again, like, keeps them away from getting or becoming becoming bigger than what they are for the next 10, 20, 30 years perhaps. It'll take another 2-3 generations before this is completely over. But at the same time, what is very important to note, like some of these tribals like the Nagas, who are still like living in those idyllic settings, Nagas and the Halakis and the they, in a way, like, they are still they still have access to the best, and you do not want them to move from where they are, because especially after the lockdown, as we have realized that this is a society we aspire to become again. Sustainable practices, environmental friendly, clean air, large spaces to live in, not like 4 walls of your home. So they are already living that. So it's a very confusing. Although on one side they're aspiring for education, schools, better jobs, better ways of life. At the same time, what most of them actually really want when you speak to these tribals is as less as possible. They do not want their lives to be interfered in any way. They want to live where they are, get food from the forest, and they're actually quite happy where they are. It's only when you pull them out and make them make the forest produce inaccessible for them is when the problems start. Can we have the next question?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. The next question comes from Singla Mook. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. How do you study caste violence in rural Indian villages?
So this is a complicated question because what I've realized, the more I interact with these people, things have actually become more classist than casteist. Now, because people have suddenly, because this generation especially has had access to education, they have access to technology like mobile phones, internet on their mobile phones. So their appearance, it's very easy to be what you're not. It's very easy to forget what caste you come from. So in a way, globalization has reached even the remotest Indian village. So it has leveled the platform there. Now it's become more classism than casteist, because now it's it's only the political leaders who make it a bigger issue than it is, because since they can trace it down, they have access to records and data which they can trace out and make it a political issue and make things complicated. But essentially, the struggle for life is so dire in these villages because of the population issues and access to healthcare, etc. That for them, caste hardly matters. What matters to them right now is class. Like everyone suddenly has a knowledge of certain standard of living that they aspire to. People who come from the lowest communities are suddenly have access to sports, where they have access to weights, they have access to how the men have access to how they want to look, the women have access to Western clothes and appearances and how they want their faces to be, makeup, all of that. Suddenly they know what kind of job profiles they want, or even if it's menial job, how they want to appear while they're doing all this. So things are getting really complicated, and now I guess it's become more a study of class than caste. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, Anirudh would like to ask another question. Anirudh, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Athiya. Ma'am, my question is, the nomadic tribes, they don't have the caste certificate. So they don't get the government privileges and opportunities. So they don't have the caste certificate. So what are they missing upon? And how can we give them the platform that they want?
So, honestly, Anirudh, if it was for me to decide, or if it was me to suggest, I would say that these tribes essentially need to be left alone. The reason is that where they come from. Number one, if they are left in their in the places that they essentially came from, which is like the deepest of the forests and the remotest corners of our country, where pollution and mining operations still haven't reached, or deforestation hasn't happened. They have access to best air, they have access to best food, they have access to best. What is it that we aspire for as a society today? What do we want from education? This is what we want, right? We want good food, we want a good place to live in, we want clean air, we want this is what we aspire for. Even after all the education, things get complicated when you start moving them from where they belong, and then you try to give them education, and which they are not ready for yet. So the lesser you intervene, look at the tribals in Andamans. They have their own ecosystem, they have their own local doctors, they have their own solutions and remedies for their diseases. These sorcerers of the Kunumba tribals are known to have solutions to everyday problems like asthma. They also have a cure for AIDS. So they all have their own ecosystem to practice. And the lesser you disturb the ecosystem, the healthier it is. On one side, you want them, you are like trying to give them education, and then it becomes a zero-sum game because it takes them nowhere. It'll give them another 100 years to, become what they really, completely become a part of the mainstream society. And by then the mainstream society has started as another set of problems. So essentially, ultimately we are aspiring to live like them, right, today. So I feel the lesser you intervene with the kind of lives they're living, the better it is.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question comes from Rohit. What are the repercussions of increasing gender disparity in employment post-lockdown?
I guess, I guess this is probably is not the right forum to address this issue, because what we're talking about right now is essentially castes and employment and castes and tribals and employment related to them. But then, if you were to ask of my opinion on what gender issues, the increasing gender issues when it comes to these communities, the professionals in these the professions which were so deeply interlinked with castes and the tribals both, they have traditionally been practicing certain roles, and they've had a lot of flexibility. This was before Christianity had come in, before missionaries had reached them, before Hinduism had reached them, before the animist followers, the local traditional people, they had a lot of freedom to move about. So, their everyday lives were about getting the best food possible, and having a safe place to live in. For them, these are the two important things. Now, who did that in what way? Like whether the man got the food by hunting or the woman got it by forest gathering, how did they keep them safe? Whether the man had to kill people to keep them safe, or whether the women had to, have their own scheming techniques of increasing security around them. Who did not matter. So this gender is essentially a more mainstream problem than a fringe society problem. It's only when you have access to more that these things become more distinct. But in spite of the roles being given to the men and women in these fringe societies like the tribals and the people living on the edges, basically, the gender roles are very, very weakly defined. They're not restricted to their gender roles. So that's.
Thank you, ma'am.
I hope that answers.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question comes from Keisha. She asks, could you talk about the title of your book, White as Milk and Rice?
Yeah, I get this a lot, Keisha. So basically, the halakis. The halu means halu in Kannada means milk. So basically, what halakis means is as white as milk. What they were trying to. So basically, the folklore goes such that halakis never existed as people, but one day when Parvati was taking food to Shiva, and she dropped it on the way. So and then she went back home to get more food, and that's when Shiva came back looking for Parvati, because food had still not come to him, and he found these mounds of rice. And when he touched it, they turned into people, and that's why they were as pure as that, because they'd been made by Shiva. So that's a reason. So that's one bit. And then, the sorcerers, the Kurumbas. There's one community of Kurumbas who I've mentioned in the book and who I have spoken in the book called Alu Kurumbas. Now, because Kurumbas were known to be sorcerers, a certain community of these Kurumbas started calling themselves Alu Kurumba as they were integrating into the mainstream society to claim that they weren't really bad people. Alu, they were pure, like they were white. So, that's the reason I titled the book White as Milk and Rice, because the whole irony of it, you are these people who are essentially dark and who are known to be, the lower communities of the society. And they're trying to, break free of these stereotypes by calling themselves, white as milk and rice. And hence the title.
Thank you, ma'am. That was really beautiful. The next question comes from Shrutika. She asks, could you please talk a bit about the condition of tribal women today?
I think I've addressed that through my conversations. Have I not? Do you want me to talk more about it?
Ma'am, if you could just brush it up again, just for the sake of...
Yeah, of course. Well, right now, most of these tribals, it depends upon from tribal to tribal, Some of these tribals have completely been wiped out of their, they do not have their own identity now because they've been so deeply integrated into the mainstream society that most of them have lost their own dialects, their own languages, their own clothing, their traditions, their cultural practices. It's been completely wiped out. At the same time, there's some of them who are still clinging on to them, like even if it's by a very thin thread, but they're very closely clinging on to this. So that is one aspect of it. But then at the same time, most of them are right now, hanging between the old and new. Like they're trying to change, but they've not changed yet, and hence they're battling the issues that come with like a changing society. So they're not educated yet. They're trying to find jobs. They want to be a part of the forest, yet they want access to, what the world offers to them. So I had met Money. Money basically was Mani, what he really wants is to let the Kudumbas be. He does not want them to be disturbed because they live in Nilgiris, which are beautiful, plenty of water, plenty of food, plenty of fresh air, and they just want them to let be. But because of deforestation and because of the constant interference of the other tribal communities like the Badagas and the Todas, which are slightly higher caste than Kurumbas. The constant interference from them has really shook them in their own premise. So what they want is to break free and be on their own and choose what they want after that. Whether they want education or they want to be like left alone and in their own ecosystem. So I guess another 20 years and things become more clear. But the state of the kind of action that the government should be taking right now is to keep them as far away from mainstream culture as possible, because that's the only way you can retain their old practices and old knowledge that they very closely guard.
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for that. The next question comes from Vishnu. Ma'am, it's pretty long. If you would like me to read it out, I can, or you could read it in the chat box as well.
Okay. The COVID restrictions from the past 2 years have made it very difficult for single-screen theatres in many cities like Mumbai, Kolkata to survive. These theatres have a rich history and architectural backgrounds. So what is your take on the effect of dying professions like these? When I talk about dying professions in my book, The Lost Generation, I talk mostly about professions that are very closely linked with caste. So, I don't really have an opinion about a new profession like theaters, etc., and theater owners, etc. So I don't know if this is the right question to bring up on this platform. But then what I strongly believe in is that things that are meant to go, especially you can't have telephone operators like now like you did in time of your grandfather. You cannot have a radio is a dying art form, and so is the people you had back then, like a lot of these new professions have come in, related to the computers and the technological data mining and data security, etc. So to make way for these new professions, some of these old professions will have to go. This is the time of Netflix, which is the best way possible. It's cheap. You're sitting at home. You are watching really good content. There are lesser imposition. There's lesser editing and cutting through, slashing through all the content. So you have the best content available, which you can watch with limited number of people without planning much. So then why bother with holding on to the idea of a theater? Why not let that go and bring something else in? Old things have to die. The practice of writing this book wasn't to really retain all these old professions. The practice was to understand how the changes happen, so that when these changes happen more in future, we are better prepared for it. But before that, there were these Burakatha artists who were the storytellers. So I'm actually documenting about those times, not times, say, like the colonial times. I'm talking about even before that, like something which has its root in tradition, in even more ancient traditions. But well, I'm sure I answered your question. How do you bring back storytellers? I mean, you can still make them perform once in a while at these public meetings. The government can sponsor it, make it adapt to our times and do it. But the fact is that it'll just become an art form then, not a profession.
Definitely, ma'am. Ma'am, I also had a question about relating to as like what you said. Do you think that, so as we discussed, it would be preferable not to interrupt in their livelihoods, to let them be as they are? And a lot of their jobs are defined by their caste identity. So if that is replaced, like as you said, do you think a lot of people will be affected? Like, do you think their entire livelihoods will in a way be uprooted if we ask them to just let go of their caste identity?
Can you, repeat that question? Because I think you linked both tribals and you linked the two books together. That's why. Is it possible for you to repeat the question?
Oh yes, okay, ma'am. So basically, how you talked about in the today's session, how we should, how casteism is being replaced by classism and things like that.
Right.
And a lot of these people, like the artists that you talk about, whose job was defined by their caste identity. So as we let go of these caste identities, and a lot of them will find, replacing, as we talked about how rich their histories is, they will find more jobs, they will find things to do. But do you think as a whole their community will be affected a lot when we get rid of their identities in general? Because even if their caste identities were like oppressing them, they were what defined them for a very long time. So do you think it will inversely affect them to get rid of these identities?
Not really, because things change, when you look at the pandas, because most of the stuff is now digitized. Fewer people go and record deaths, like I said. Fewer people perform like the last rites of their families in Haridwar and, places like these by the banks of Gangas. Slowly they are losing their identity, but they're also rediscovering it in the next generation. I mean, I do feel bad for that generation that, there's something that's so, although however deeply interlinked and however oppressing it was something that they identified it. It is what made them what they were. But then when they left and the next, what are the sons doing now? They're in the IT sector. Some are working in Bangalore. Some are in Hyderabad. So there they are, rediscovering what it is, the new, what it is to be in this world and what it is to be without that sort of identity. It is a deep loss, but then, things have changed. Back then we used to have hunter-gatherers. I mean, that has gone and we have become what we are today, right? We used to be, we used to have like the Devadasis, the temple dancers. We used to have so many such professions which were so deeply, deeply interlinked with caste, Even sex work was so deeply interlinked with caste, but that's gone. And same work has been rediscovered without associating it with caste. At the same time, that work has been replaced with new works. And it is basically what is important to be dynamic and what is important is to be adapt with times more than clinging on to things I mean, ultimately all this is meant to be at the museum, right? Museums are there for a reason, and ultimately all this has to become a part of the museum. And that's the only way we can preserve it, because they've been such deeply interlinked, and caste had become, although it had its roots in very beautiful practices, but it becomes so oppressive in a lot of ways that it could not keep up with the modern times. So we had to let go of that. And if you're letting go of that, you have to let go of this too. So I guess, do we have any more questions from anybody?
No, there's no more questions from today's session.
Pardon?
There's no more questions.
Okay, great. All right.
But
So I really...
Just one second. I think Anirudh has a question. I'm so sorry. Anirudh,
Sure.
if you would like to ask your question.
Ma'am, is it possible for you to tell what will be your next book based upon?
Oh, I wish I could talk more about it, but unfortunately I cannot. I'm in the research stage right now. It got slightly delayed because of the pandemic, but then all I can tell you is it's going to be based in Calcutta. So and I'm not allowed to talk more because I'm under contract not to speak more about it right now. I hope that's okay. But also there's a kids version, like an young adolescent version of the same book, White as Milk and Rice, coming out soon. So I guess that's one thing to look forward to. Not for you guys, but maybe your younger siblings. It was an entertaining session. Thank you. The questions were so engaging and so diverse. So it was fun answering them. It's always great speaking to young students. I really hope you enjoyed the session. Sorry for the technical errors and the little stuff. I'm usually more used to a question answer round. So I guess that sort of helps me, like a person moderating the session. That makes it easier. But I guess this was new to me, but it was still so much fun. If you guys do end up reading the book, do post a picture of it or tag me on Instagram or Twitter. My handle on Instagram is Nidhi Dugar Kundalia. So please do look me up, and whatever any other question that you have, please ask me there, and I'll be most willing to answer them. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming. And we would deeply like to thank you from all of PSA and all of its members and today's participants. We would like to extend a very warm thank you to you for enlightening us. And I'm sure that all of us learned a lot today, because I personally did not know about most of these tribes and these, artworks. And everyone learned a lot. And so thank you for sharing your research and your years of work with us. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. See you all soon.